Hello and welcome to the turbulent world. I'm your host, James Dorsey. Intellectual honesty is a rare commodity in the divide between Israelis and Palestinians. It is even rarer with the rise of Jewish ultra-nationalism and a generation of Israelis and Palestinians nurtured on prejudiced, biased, and often supremacist perceptions of the other. The irony is that historically it was far right militants, and currently it is fringe left wing intellectuals who displayed intellectual honesty, even if their conclusions differ radically. With few exceptions, intellectual honesty has long been lost on the Israeli right and left. What intellectual honesty survives is posited in fringe pockets of the left that propagate a paradigm cultural change on both sides of the Israeli Palestinian divide that goes against the grain of mainstream Israeli and Palestinian thinking, and in today's fog of war, has a pie in the sky quality. Even so, these pockets put forward ideas that offer a pathway towards a resolution of the Israeli Palestinian conflict that has the potential to bridge the trauma shaping generations, contribute to preventing a one or two state solution from producing future wars, and ensure that peace agreements with Israel have street credibility on both sides of the divide, rather than amount to arrangements among elites with little popular support beyond Israel's borders. Education sits at the core of contrasting views of the future of Israeli Palestinian relations and diametrically opposite historical narratives. Last week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterated in an address to the US Congress his prioritization of de radicalization of Gaza through religiously guided educational reform as a prerequisite for the reconstruction of the war ravaged strip. Mr. Netanyahu first insisted on de radicalization when in February he offered a vague outline of his post war Gaza plan. Since then, Mr. Netanyahu has drawn on a 32-page proposal drafted by four Israeli academics that calls for the creation of a positive horizon for the defeated nation, de radicalization through education for peace, defined as eradicating jihadist ambitions, and the nurturing of a popular repudiation of violence and embrace of effective governance. The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de radicalized Gaza. A new generation of Palestinians must no longer be taught to hate Jews, but rather to live in peace with us, Mr. Netanyahu told the Congress. What Mr. Netanyahu means by de radicalization is an educational system that refrains from promoting Palestinian national aspirations and the right to resist Israeli occupation, even non-violently, and teaches history and social sciences in line with Israel's version of the history of Israeli Palestinian relations. Mr. Netanyahu has already taken a first step by targeting educational institutions in Gaza, including all of the Strip's universities, and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. UNRWA operated 288 schools, or 40% of all schools in Gaza before the war, serving as shelters for Palestinians displaced by the war, and according to Israel, as bases for Hamas. Most of the schools have been severely damaged or destroyed in the Israeli military campaign. Earlier this year, Mr. Netanyahu asserted that in UNRWA schools, they've been teaching the doctrines of extermination of Israel, the doctrines of terrorism, lauding terrorism, glorifying terrorism. Israeli textbook watchdog Impact SE reported in November that at least 14 of UNRWA's 9,367 teachers in Gaza, or 0.15%, had supported Hamas violence in social media postings, including the group's October 7 attack on Israel. The report added that at least 100 Hamas members committing the terror attacks are graduates of UNRWA's education system. Before the war, UNRWA operated 709 schools, catering to 530,000 students across the Middle East. Almost 300,000 of the students attended UNRWA schools in Gaza. The report highlighted select examples from UNRWA school materials that legitimately should be questioned, including describing the firebombing of an Israeli bus as a barbecue party. The report does not indicate how representative the examples are. Even so, Israel's parliament, the Knesset, is debating three bills that would curtail UNRWA's operations, including one that would designate the UN group as a terrorist organization. Countering mainstream ethnocentric Israeli and Palestinian identity politics that shape education systems is a revival in Israel of a Levantine identity based on the notion of a pluralist, multicultural society. On the one hand, Israelis feel unwanted in our region. It's rejecting us as an occupying Jewish country. And of course, nobody is exactly waiting for us in Europe to move back. That in between space is a very Israeli experience. I'm not sure that an Egyptian from Cairo feels unwelcome in their surroundings. I don't think Palestinians feel that this region rejects them. Rather, it's that they're being repressed by us, said Idan Zivoni, the author of a recent book on Levantinism. Levantinism's revival on the fringe of Israeli society precedes the Gaza war. It appears to have survived the ultra-nationalist onslaught sparked by Hamas's October 7 attack and Israel's war on Gaza. In 2019, Tel Aviv's Eretz Israel Museum, home to some of the country's most important archaeology, ethnography, photography, folklore, and local history collections, staged an exhibition focused on the late Egyptian-born novelist and essayist Jacqueline Kahanoff, one of the most influential writers on Levantinism. This month saw the publication in Hebrew of two books on Levantinism, 2 years after two earlier books were published. A product of pre-revolution cosmopolitan Cairo, who emigrated to Israel in 1954, Mrs. Kahanoff believed that for Israel to be recognized and accepted by its Arab neighbors, it would have to empower its Mizrahi citizens with roots in the Arab and Muslim world as cultural ambassadors, who historically were looked down upon by their Ashkenazi brethren of European descent. Mrs. Kahanoff's thinking is relevant at a time when Israelis and Jews debate the nature of the Jewish identity, relations between Jews and non-Jews, the role of religion, and the future of the West Bank and Gaza, conquered by Israel in the 1967 Middle East War, even though it goes against the grain of mainstream Israeli and Palestinian thinking and challenges the two peoples' nationalistic framework. Levantism leaves open the options of a one or two state solution to the Israeli Palestinian conflict, but is particularly relevant for a unified state that risks erupting in civil war, even if Israeli Jews and Palestinians would have equal rights. Mrs. Kahanoff understood what our prime ministers, generals, and ministers still failed to understand. We need to teach Arabic from a young age. We need to completely change our attitude toward the Arab world. We need to understand that we are now part of it, to maintain a discourse that isn't so insanely racist, but rather loving and connecting, that knows the intellectual treasures that Islam has to offer us, said Ketsia Alon, the co editor of a recent volume on Levantinism. Mrs. Karnoff and her disciples would likely recoil from being mentioned in the same breath as Zev Jabotinsky, the early 20th century intellectual godfather of far right Jewish nationalism, and Mr. Netanyahu's ideological cradle, who propagated a Jewish state in all of Palestine, and storied Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. Yet, what Mrs. Karnoff and Messieurs Jabotinsky and Dayan have in common is the intellectual honesty to recognize Palestinians as human beings with legitimate aspirations, even that though that leads them to radically different visions of the future. It is the kind of honesty absent in supremacist and racist pronouncements of Messieurs Netanyahu, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, Mr. Jabotinsky's ideological heirs. Messieurs Jabotinsky and Dayan recognized Palestinian aspirations, but argued there was no room in Palestine for two competing claims. While intellectually honest, their us or them approach provided the recipe for permanent conflict and violence in which only one party could win by defeating and subjugating the other. To think that the Arabs will voluntarily consent to the realization of Zionism in return for the cultural and economic benefits we can bestow on them is infantile. This childish fantasy of our Arabophiles comes from some kind of contempt for the Arab people, some kind of unfounded view of this race as a rabble ready to be bribed to sell out their homeland for for a railroad network, Mr. Jabotinsky argued, deriding Zionist factions that sought compromise with the Palestinians. Speaking at the 1956 funeral of an Israeli farmer brutally murdered by Palestinian militants, Mr. Dayan acknowledged the plight of the Palestinians, insisting that Israel would have to live by the sword. Let us not cast blame on the murderers. For 8 years, they have been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes, we have been transforming the lands and villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate, Mr. Dayan said. Let us not be deterred from seeing the loathing that is inflaming and filling the lives of hundreds of thousands of Arabs living around us. This is our life's choice, to be prepared and armed, strong and determined, lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down, he added. For now, Mr. Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich's exclusivist ultra-nationalism drown out Mrs. Kahanoff and Mrs. Alon's calls for an inclusive approach that recognizes the legitimacy of rival claims and advocates greater cross-cultural engagement. Nevertheless, major Israeli cultural institutions focusing on alternative approaches, coupled with the publication of books and newspaper articles, and public gatherings in which forward looking ideas are discussed, offer a ray of hope, particularly at a time of war and hardened divides when supremacist intellectual dishonesty trumps intellectual honesty. Thank you for joining me today. I am grateful to those who have become paid subscribers. I need some more to enable me to continue cutting through the fog of kinetic and information wars and offer fact based analysis. No doubt, you will have noticed that the turbulent world has no sponsors and no advertisers. This guarantees the column and podcast independence. Instead, the turbulent world depends on the support of its readers and listeners to cover the cost of producing the column and podcast. You can contribute by clicking on Substack on the subscription button at jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you, take care, and best wishes.